The map loomed large in the room. It lay stretched across the war cabinet table like a ceremonial cloth. Thick paper reinforced at the seams, its corners pinned down by brass weights polished smooth by decades of handling. The seas were washed in muted blue, the continents in parchment tan, and borders etched with careful lines. From a distance, it could have been an artifact in a museum, the sort of thing schoolboys stared at while dreaming of distant lands and old heroes. But the men gathered around it were no schoolboys. Hundreds of little indicators dotted the map, pins, tabs, and narrow strips of colored tape. Some were new, bright, and clean. Others were dulled from being moved and returned and moved again. Each meant something that could not be truly folded and put away. Each meant weight, heat, hunger, marching feet, holes cutting through water, engines coughing into life at dawn. Each pin represented hundreds to potentially thousands of men, and the red lines, carefully placed pieces of thread pinned into place, represented the path their bodies would take. Commander Hadrian Voss stood at the Emperor's right hand, with his hands clasped behind his back, posture immaculate. His uniform was black and gold, pressed sharp enough to slice through the tension in the room. His hair was trimmed to perfection. His face was composed, no slackness, no indulgent expression, no foolish flourish to give away his eternal state. He had the look of a man built for command, broad-shouldered, controlled, the sort of presence that stilled a room without demanding it. He had been admired since the academy, not for warmth, not for charm, for precision, for clarity, for the way he took control and got the job done, whether on the battlefield or in a planning office. For the way he made decisions not from rash emotion or hunches, but by measuring the information and predicting exactly what others would do, even his opponents, and positioning himself to come out on top. The war cabinet chamber itself had been built long before any of the men in the room had been born. Stone walls rose into arches that upheld the gravity of the room. Narrow stained glass windows admitted light in colored slats, diffused by the thick glass. Candles burned in iron sconces regardless of the hour, not out of necessity, but out of tradition, as if the room refused to trust modernity. The air held the faint scent of beeswax and oil, and beneath it, the dry, papery smell of old documents, plans, treaties, casualty lists, memos stamped and sealed. Around the table stood the men who moved the empire and directed the nation. Admirals in deep blue with gold braids at their cuffs, their faces weathered by salty wind and long nights. Generals in field gray and green, their boots scuffed from use despite careful polish. Ministers in traditional Anglic robes with eyes ringed by fatigue. Clerks hovered near the walls like shadows, tablets and ledgers ready, eyes lowered unless addressed. And at the head of the table stood the emperor. He wore no crown. He rarely did in chambers like this. The chain at his neck was plain gold, its only ornament the green and gold cross of Anglia. Worn slightly at the edges over the duration of his reign, his hair had begun to go from a dark brown to a grayish silver. His face carried lines etched deep by years of decisions that could not be undone. By prayers offered in solitude, by the continual funerals and trials the years have brought. Yet his eyes remained clear and steady, moving across the map with the practiced attention of one who understands the gravity and weight of his every breath and decision. He rested his fingertips lightly on the paper. This war progresses well, the Emperor began, voice calm and measured, but it is not yet decided. The room quieted. Our coastal operations have secured the major ports along Western Africa, the Emperor continued. Our citizens in the region shall no longer fear jihadist attacks from Crescent-controlled ports, and that is a victory we must celebrate. Additionally, our fleets dominate the eastern Mediterranean. The Crescent Navy was small in number, and the majority of their warships have either been sunk or relegated to the few protected ports they have left. Their conventional formations have been broken and appear to be forming a defensive perimeter around the Nile's mouth and the Suez Canal. Their air bases in the south have been neutralized or captured, but they still have a small but capable air force near the Suez and further into Arabia. A general nodded once. An admiral made a brief notation, pencil scratching quietly. But, the Emperor said, the word hanging like a ball from a chain. We are stalled. He moved his hand to the blue line of the Nile. On the map, it ran like a vein through parchment. Along its length were names printed in small letters. Towns, crossings, railheads. On paper it seemed tame, as if one could step over it. Voss had seen rivers in war. He knew better. Rivers were not a thing to be trifled with. They were a world unto themselves. Mud, reeds, and insects, the heat of the desert that baked the mind dull. The water itself could be both a lifeline and a trap. Most likely narrow roads along the banks, perfect for ambush. Villages that watched from shutters. One could easily run a guerrilla campaign on both sides of the river and make advancing difficult. Our armies advance northward, the Emperor said, and every mile costs more than it should. The enemy refuses decisive engagement. They strike at night, ambush convoys, retreat into villages, and then vanish into the terrain. The Minister of State, thin, composed, and perpetually cautious, leaned forward slightly and steepled. They bleed us, the Emperor continued, not through one decisive engagement, but through 1,000 small cuts. A hush followed. Every man present had read the reports. Casualty figures that looked modest when compared to the Empire's population, yet felt intolerable because it was unnecessary and wasteful, fighting in a war against a much smaller power. Death by mine, death by rifle fire from balcony, death by a boy with a field telephone and a wire. The Red Crescent forces are waging a guerrilla war along the Nile, the Emperor said, and his voice hardened slightly with a sober edge of reality. And it is effective. One of the generals, an older and scarred veteran of earlier wars, spoke carefully. We have adapted our patrol patterns, Your Majesty. We have increased convoy escort. We have... And still the reports come in, the Emperor said, a sting undercutting his words. Still our men die day in and day out, for every inch we take. His hands drifted toward the eastern edge of the map, toward the sea lanes. They persist, the Emperor said. Their ammunition stockpiles refuse to dwindle, and new munitions appear in their hands every month. Much of their communications and electronics equipment, captured in raids, is beyond what their domestic industry should be able to produce and sustain. An admiral cleared his throat. Foreign supply? Yes, the Emperor said. The only rational conclusion is foreign supply. The Minister of State spoke with measured caution. Vesperia? We suspect it, the Emperor said. They are the only major power that has both the industrial capabilities to wage a proxy war against us and a reason to do it. The Red Crescent Republic and Vesperian Commune both share roots in Marxist ideology, and thus, despite their religious differences, see the Anglican Empire and its traditional Christian spirit as an existential threat to the spread of communism. We cannot prove it, an admiral added. His tone held something like frustration. Any kind of public moves would require some kind of proof, lest the conflict would expand unnecessarily. No, the Emperor agreed. Not yet. His gaze shifted to Voss. Commander Hadrian Voss. Voss stepped forward half a pace and inclined his head. He did not speak until invited. It was not fear, but out of discipline and respect. Your assessment, the Emperor said. Voss placed one gloved hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding himself in the material world of ink and paper. His eyes swept the map. He looked in segments, tracing routes and distances, imagining movement and potential points of conflict. He saw the war as a living thing. Supply arteries, nerve centers, vulnerabilities, the flow of men and equipment, conceptualized and categorized. The Crescent cannot defeat us conventionally, Voss said. His voice was calm and precise. They know that in any open field engagement, our forces would crush them. Instead, they seek to exhaust us. If they get the public to turn on us and exhaust our moral and political capital, then they will force us to stop our advance. A general shifted his stance and a minister's jaw tightened. They benefit from delay, Voss continued. Every week we remain bogged down along the Nile, the Empire pays twice. Once in provisions, fuel, and manpower, but also in faith. Public faith in victory and in the justice of this war. The Minister of State frowned slightly. Faith is not a metric one can simply measure. It becomes one when it falters, Voss replied sharply. He moved his gloved finger along the sea lanes. The captured equipment matches those used by Vesperia, so we can be rather confident they are the ones supplying them. And yet Vesperia avoids direct confrontation, an admiral said. As they always have, Voss replied. They favor proxy war. It allows them to wear us down without sacrificing their own men to do so. The Crescent offers them plausible deniability and a large pool of men willing to sacrifice themselves in the name of their false god. The Emperor watched him, expression still. Recommendation, the Emperor said. Voss did not hesitate. Speed. Several heads turned. Speed was always seductive. It was always dangerous. It promised decisive outcomes, but often resulted in a myriad of unforeseen costs. We have been methodical, Voss continued, and method has served us well. But method becomes a liability when the enemy adapts to our methods. The longer we remain on this axis, he indicated the Nile, the more predictable we become and continue to give them exactly the leverage they need. The general spoke with quiet resistance. If we push faster, we risk overextension. We cannot risk losing more men by pushing too quickly. Voss's gaze did not soften. Overextension is a risk. That is why I have a solution to mitigate the risk. He tapped the northern Egyptian coast, an arc of shoreline that faced the Mediterranean. We take a beachhead, Voss said. We stage forces in Sicily and land forces with overwhelming naval and air support. If we can establish a foothold in the north, it should relieve pressure down south. From there, we move inland, threaten the crescent's rear, and forcing them to respond with conventional formations. And the Nile corridor? An admiral asked. Continue to push forward, Voss replied. We create pressure from two directions. As they are being pressured, we push for the Suez and attempt to cut off any reinforcements and supplies going towards the Nile. The Minister of State's fingers tightened. An invasion is not a chess move, Commander. It is a public act. It will have political consequences. Voss finally turned his eyes towards him. They were pale steel, calculating and calm. There are consequences now, he said. We either bleed public relations disasters or suffer one predictable now and stop the bleeding. Silence fell. The room silently began to settle into acceptance. The sort that comes when truth is said plainly and reality is laid bare. The Emperor lifted his hand, and the room stilled. Enough, he said decisively. He looked down at the map again, tracing the Suez Canal with his finger. It was a thin line on paper. In reality, it was a choke point of history. A place where empires rose and fell. Control it and you control the artery of the world, and one of the gates into the Mediterranean. We secure Suez by land and sea, the Emperor said. We must secure the Suez and push the crescent forces out of the Nile. He lifted his gaze to Voss. Commander Hadrian Voss, he said formally. You will be given command of the invasion force into northern Egypt. A clerk stepped forward, placing a sealed packet on the table before Voss. A wax stamp bore the imperial cross. You will oversee the amphibious landing, the Emperor continued, and the establishment of the beachhead. You will coordinate naval bombardment, air support, and ground deployment. You will secure lodgment sufficient enough to enable inland advance. Voss bowed his head. Yes, Your Majesty. The weight of both duty and trust was suddenly heavy upon his shoulders. The meeting suddenly shifted from planning into execution. Orders were issued, timetables adjusted, assets reassigned. The great machine of the empire turned another notch forward. Yet, before dismissing the cabinet, the Emperor did something that marked Anglia as distinct from any empire that had ever brought up the sword against it. He prayed. He placed both hands flat on the paper, palms pressing lightly against the world, as if blessing the ink would somehow bless the men it represented. The movement was not dramatic. It was simple. In a room of brass and steel, the pinnacle of mankind, it felt like the intrusion of something older, something that bore the weight of eternity. My lord, the Emperor said, voice low. Grant us wisdom. The room went utterly silent. Even the clerks ceased their writing and bowed their heads. Grant us restraint, he continued. Guard our soldiers and the innocent alike. Expose the corruption of this world. When we bear the sword, let us do it in your name and not for vain purpose. Voss stood with his hands behind his back, eyes lowered. He did not dislike prayer. He had been raised in it. He had recited it in chapels and in barracks, in the hush before battle, and in the aftermath of it. It was one of those things which presented itself to him as a duty, rather than a privilege. Let us act victoriously in these trying times. Let the plans of the wicked come to ruin. He paused. And if a hidden hand feeds wickedness, he said, his voice tightening, bring it into the light for all to see. Amen. Amen, the room chanted in response. The emperor lifted his hands from the table. Men filed out in pairs and trios, voices already returning to practical matters. Timetables, tonnage, fuel consumption, landing craft numbers. Voss remained near the table, waiting quietly. As the emperor gathered his documents, Voss's eyes caught a folder at the far end of the table. It was sealed, thicker than most, and the label had the most unusual phrase on it. Unusual activity, Sinai. Voss did not stare. It was not his duty to stare and wonder. His gaze touched the folder and moved away, but the words remained in his mind. The emperor noticed. He said nothing. He simply slid the folder into his own stack and turned toward the private door that led to his office. Commander, he said. Voss followed. The emperor's office was smaller than the cabinet chamber, quieter, more personal. The palace's grandeur softened here into something lived in. Bookshelves lined the walls, their volumes worn by use. A desk stood near a tall window overlooking the palace gardens, where winter trees stood bare against a gray sky. A lamp burned low, and daylight streamed into the room, casting amber light across the whole room. The emperor closed the door himself. He removed his gloves with deliberate care and set them on the desk. The act of ungloving was a silent transition from imperial authority before witnesses to the weight of a private conversation between friends. Voss stood tall, unsure of the nature of this conversation. There is something else, the emperor said. He placed the sealed folder on the desk. Unusual activity, Sinai. Voss eyed the report. Hundreds of possibilities running through his mind. The emperor broke the seal. Inside were typed reports and photographs, grainy aerial images, witness statements dated to less than 2 months ago. The chaplain's handwritten note copied into official format. The emperor spread them out on the desk with the sober care of a man laying down something he did not fully understand. These reports have come in from multiple sources, the emperor said. Reconnaissance pilots, ground patrols, chaplains, civilians. Voss's gaze hovered over the photographs. One image showed a village at night, blurred by clouds or haze. Another showed bodies lying in a street. Shapes scattered like discarded clothing. Another was a close report. No sign of conventional engagement, no shell craters, no structural collapse. Victims display cauterization inconsistent with known weapons. Voss's mind began its work automatically, cataloging, assessing, discarding what did not fit, searching for what did. Fog, he said, voice level. Yes, the Emperor replied. Fog that moves uphill. Fog that arrives with unnatural speed. Many wish to write it off as a natural phenomenon, but death seems to follow it. Voss slowly nodded. He let the words settle in his mind like stones. Some reports speak of lights, the Emperor continued. Flashes within the fog. The witnesses that survive cannot describe them clearly. Pilots describe them as too precise for a natural occurrence, but cannot get close enough to discern their source. Voss's eyes moved over a typed paragraph. The village was overtaken in seconds. No gunfire heard from altitude. Flashes observed. Fog dissipates. The villagers were all dead. He felt something tighten in his chest. Fear, yes, but not just fear. War had rules. Even insurgency had patterns. This felt like something that refused a pattern, and that frustrated him. The kind of thing that lit a fire in him until he could categorize it. Superstition spreads quickly, Voss said. Yes, the Emperor replied. And sometimes superstition grows around real events. He looked directly at Voss. You are not to prioritize this above the invasion, the Emperor said. Your mission remains the beachhead. But if you encounter anything that aligns with these reports, anything at all, you are to pursue it. We need to know what this is, and I trust you to figure out what it is. Voss inclined his head. Yes, Your Majesty. The Emperor's gaze hardened slightly. These are things, he said slowly, that do not fit neatly into our categories. We fight men, the Emperor continued. We plan as men. But we serve God who reigns over all things. Be vigilant and trust in him. I will, Voss replied. The Emperor's shoulders lowered slightly, as if he had carried the weight of this burden alone and was relieved to entrust another with it. One he trusted to carry it without being crushed. Commander, he said more quietly, you are admired. Men trust you. They believe you cannot be shaken. Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Do not let that admiration become a mask, the Emperor said. We are all susceptible to pride. Voss held the Emperor's gaze. I understand, he said. The Emperor nodded once. Go, he said. Make speed. Voss bowed, turned, and left the office. He walked through the palace corridors with measured steps, the stone beneath his boots echoing softly. Guards snapped to attention as he passed. Clerks hurried along the side of the halls with armfuls of documents. palace was a living organism, its veins filled with paper, orders, and men. Outside, winter air hit his face, cold and clean. The city beyond the palace moved in its normal rhythm. Engines warming, trucks rattling, distant horns, the low murmur of people going about their day. Somewhere a church bell rang, the sound drifting over rooftops as a reminder that empires have souls. Voss stood a moment at the top of the palace steps, looking out. He did not feel heroic. He did not feel afraid. He felt something more dangerous. Uncertainty. Northern Egypt, beachhead, naval bombardment, air superiority, landing craft, casualty estimates. All these things fit neatly and can be conceptualized and put into action. However, beneath it, the words from the folder lingered. Fog that moves uphill, flashes. Village is dead without battle. Voss dismissed the thought with the same discipline he often dismissed fatigue and hunger. Speculation was useless until evidence arrived. He did not have the luxury of imagining ghosts. He descended the steps and moved into the waiting vehicle that would carry him to the staging headquarters. As the driver pulled away, the palace receded behind him. Ahead lay the sea, the coast, the narrow strip of sand where men would step out of landing craft and into fire. Voss stared through the window, his reflection faint against the moving world. He was precise, cool, admired, and now he carried an emperor's trust like a weight in his bones. The empire would land where he told it to land, and the fate of the war rested upon this landing. Somewhere, far away, beyond maps and timetables, the Sinai waited beneath a sky that stood, regardless of human certainty.